Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
All right, so we have a couple of stories that I wanted to talk about today. The first is there was a Claude Code leak. So Anthropic, who is the primary company for Claude Code, which is a large language model, LLM. We've talked about them on this show before, but there was an issue that happened very recently. Anthropic did confirm that there was an internal source code for Claude Code that was inadvertently released due to human error in a release packaging process. So it wasn't a security breach. So it wasn't like an attacker got into their code, but human error. They accidentally published essentially their code accidentally. So, but they did say that no sensitive customer data or credentials were exposed. The issue was discovered after Anthropic released version 2.1.88 of Claude Code NPM package, which contained a source map file that exposed nearly 2,000 TypeScript files and over 500,000 lines of code. So there was a security researcher, Chaofan Xu, was the first to flag it publicly on X, and his post racked up over 28.8 million views. So people were very excited about this. The leaked code base was then mirrored to a public GitHub repository where it surpassed 84,000 stars and forks. That's insane. And so when the developers started digging into the code, published details about some self-healing memory architecture, a tooling system for file reading and bash execution, multi-agent orchestration, and to spawn some sub-agents for complex tests and communication layers connecting IDE extensions to CLI or command line interface. Some of the notable findings that when people started looking into this code was a feature called Kyrios that let Claude Code operate as a persistent background agent, fixing errors and running tasks on its own without waiting for user input and even sending push notifications. There was a dream mode that was in this code that allowed Claude to consistently think in the background to develop and iterate ideas. That's really interesting and kind of scary. And then there was also something called an undercover mode for making stealth contributions to open source repositories with a system prompt telling Claude not to reveal any Anthropic internal information to commit messages or pull requests. And there were some hidden controls that injected fake tool definitions into API requests to poison training data if competitors tried to scrape Claude Code's output. And so that's basically Anthropic's attempt to covertly fight model distillation attacks. So there were some security implications with this, of course, and this is kind of the same type of attacks that we've talked about on our show before. But as soon as this code was released, and you heard 82,000 forks in this public GitHub. So as soon as that happens, you'll get copycat attacks and stuff like that. So there was a security firm called Stryker that warned that attackers were now studying how exactly the data flowed through Claude Code's 4-stage context management pipeline and craft payloads designed to survive compaction. And they were effectively persisting a backdoor along long sessions rather than relying on brute force jailbreaks. So there were a lot of attackers that were also squatting on some internal NPM packages, names to target developers, trying to compile that leaked source code and stage dependency confusion attacks. Those malicious packages were all published by a single user named Pacifier. Zscaler also reported that there were threat actors seeding Trojanized Claude Code repositories with backdoors and data stealers and cryptocurrency miners, including a Rust-based dropper deploying a Vita Stealer and Ghost Socks, a tool that's used to proxy network traffic. And so GitHub was being used as a delivery channel while attackers were relying on quote unquote official looking forks to lure unsuspecting developers. Zscaler basically said unsuspecting users cloning the quote unquote official looking forks risk immediate compromise and that threat actors were actively leveraging the Claude Code leak as social engineering lures to distribute malicious payloads with GitHub serving as the delivery channel. There's also, at the same time, and we're going to talk about it next, there was a whole NPM supply chain angle, and it one doesn't necessarily have to do with the other. It just kind of collided at the same time because at the same time there was an Axios NPM supply chain attack, which we'll talk about next. But users who tried to install or update Claude Code via NPM between a certain period of time, which was March 31st, 2026, midnight, basically 021, 0 hours, 21 minutes, and 3:29 UTC, may have pulled a Trojanized version of the Axios HTTP client containing a cross-platform remote access Trojan at the same time. So if like people were curious about the Claude Code and they tried to pull it from NPM at that time, they probably got a Trojanized version of the remote access Trojan, which we'll talk about in the NPM supply chain attack. But that's basically what happened with the Claude Code. And I would say, really, if you are curious, you better know what you're doing because there's a lot of attackers that are trying to take advantage and try to forking different repositories, seeding the code with malware, backdoors, whatever. And it's very risky if you're doing this at home for your company, whatever. So I would just stay away unless you are absolutely sure you know what you're doing. And even then, probably a very risky thing to do.
Really interesting, all of the attackers flying to this leak and attaching themselves to it. I think the different clever ways of attacking and then how this became caught up in the Axios supply chain compromise as well. Very interesting. For the most part, I don't think there's anything massively surprising here. Obviously, Anthropic should be considering new features and models, and Claude Code is really at this point considered the leader in the clubhouse in this category of AI assisted code completion and all the things it helps you do from a software development perspective. So they should be, of course, not sitting on their laurels, but trying to expand their lead. And you know what's interesting, as we've heard agentic this, agent that, as we talk through AI stuff, I think a lot of us get the idea in our head that it's Samantha from Her, and it's constantly always there and always responding and working on things in the background. But really, when we're talking about anything agentic, it just means instead of being a single prompt and response architecture, you can issue a prompt where the solution then issues sub prompts. So things like in Andy and I both work for Microsoft, so we're familiar with things like Microsoft 365 Copilot has a researcher agent. And it's called an agent because when you issue a prompt, it actually goes out and performs multiple tasks, either in parallel or in series. And now it'll even run the main research with OpenAI's GPT model, but then it will actually run Claude over the top of it to critique the output from GPT and fine tune it. So effectively doing peer review. So that's agentic in nature. So when you hear some of these features from Claude Code that Anthropic's been working on, just keep in mind anymore, a lot of AI experiences you have are actually agentic in nature, just by virtue of it's not just a prompt and response architecture. Oftentimes it's your prompt is talking to a software intermediary layer, a harness, if you will, that then is kicking off sub agents and sub prompts to actually go accomplish the task you've asked it to do. And Claude Code is certainly no exception. So just wanted to provide some context there, but overall sounds like it's interesting, certainly fun to read what's been working on and some of the findings from it. But as far as doing it yourself, if you're going to involve yourself here, try to access or download this code to review it. Be very conscientious about what you're doing. And of course, do that on a device that's built for security research and isn't your day-to-day production device.
And so moving on, just a few days ago, the Axios NPM supply chain attack happened. And so what is Axios? It's a popular HTTP client for JavaScript that's used to simplify making HTTP requests. And it has over 70 million weekly downloads. So it's not just some niche library. It's actually one of the most foundational tools in JavaScript development. And so when something like this ubiquitous gets poisoned, there's a potential blast radius that's really wide and far. And so, what actually happened on March 31st of this year, 2026, two new NPM packages, Axios version 1.14.1 and 0.30.4, were identified as malicious. They were injected with a malicious dependency to download payloads from known attacker controlled command and control servers. And Microsoft actually attributed the attack to Sapphire Sleet, which is a North Korean state act. And the attack was actually pretty clever. So the attackers didn't touch the Axios code at all. They added a fake dependency called plain-crypto.js, which is never imported by the package's runtime code. And it only exists to trigger an install time script to download a second stage remote access Trojan. So the normal app behavior remained unchanged while the malicious activity occurred silently during the NPM installation or the NPM update, as we talked about before, on developer endpoints and CI/CD systems. And so to make it look legitimate, the dependency was first seeded into a clean release, plain-crypto-js at 4.2.0, to establish a publishing history and reduce scrutiny, and then a follow-up release added the malicious install time logic. So really interesting. It was a patience play. They first built credibility by seeding a clean release, and then later on they added that malicious logic. And so since Axios packages generally are commonly updated automatically, any projects with Axios versions configured to auto update connected to the attacker's command and control servers upon installation and downloaded that second stage malware. So I'm not a coder or, usually work in CI/CD pipelines, but when you use the caret and the tilde version pretext in the package.json files, they silently pull in these versions without any human review. And so it's dangerous when you do that. And so that, if you're a developer or maybe you're a security person who's kind of learning about how CI/CD pipelines work, when you have that caret or tilde version pretext in those JSON files, that they just silently pull new versions. So that can be potentially dangerous. We do sometimes want things to auto update, but as we've seen, this is not the first supply chain attack. Even this year, I think that we've talked about, there's been actually a few. So this is a very clever way, and probably one of the most common ways that you can get compromised is through these repositories and supply chain codes. The payloads were cross-platform, so all Windows, Mac, Linux were all hit. They all connected to the same C2 resource, and the operating system selection was conveyed through the post request bodies. And the on Windows specifically, the remote access Trojan generated a unique host identifier. It collected detailed systems and hardware information, including the OS version, boot time, installed hardware, running processes, and established persistence by creating a hidden startup entry. It then communicated with the remote server using periodic and encoded HTTP post requests that were blended into normal traffic patterns, and then supported commands to execute arbitrary PowerShell code, enumerate files, inject additional payloads directly into memory, or terminate execution on demand. So very interesting stuff here. As far as Sapphire Sleet, they're, just to kind of give a little bit of background on them, they're a North Korean state actor that's been active since March 2020, focused primarily on finance, cryptocurrency, venture capital, blockchain organizations, and their primary motivation is stealing cryptocurrency wallets to generate revenue. So that's kind of important to kind of understand. Usually, when it comes to threat intelligence, motivation is a big factor. So understanding that their motivation is primarily financial is pretty important. So they commonly leverage LinkedIn to initiate contact, direct targets to malicious files hosted on services like OneDrive or Google Drive, or use fraudulent meeting links impersonating apps like Zoom. They're also tracked under names like Blue North or Crypto Core. And so, like we mentioned during our Claude Code leak, that there's that kind of connective tissue between the two things that we're talking about here, mainly because if users installed or updated Claude Code via NPM between those time frames, they may have pulled that Trojanized version of Axios along with it. So yeah, developers rushing to like check out that leaked code were potentially exposed to this state-sponsored remote access Trojan in the process. So anyone who's affected by these versions should roll back immediately to the safe versions, which are 1.14.0 or 0.30.3, and flush out the local NPM cache, rotate all your secrets and credentials, and review any CI/CD pipeline logs for NPM installs that may have pulled malicious versions. And then also look for any outbound connections to sfrclak.com, which probably is an indicator of compromise or an IOC on port 8000. You know, Microsoft did publish a whole blog on this, and their broader lesson here is really to remove that caret or tilde from your package.json for critical dependencies and pin exact versions. Use the npm ci-ignore strips to prevent post-install hooks from running, and disable automated dependency bots like Dependabot or Renovate for critical packages. So not for everything, but for your critical packages, probably better to have a human review rather than auto update. It's really interesting that we have a North Korean state actor, which is essentially running a developer targeted credential and crypto theft operation through one of these trusted packages in the JavaScript ecosystem. And then, like I said, this is not the first time for supply chain, but this is starting to become one of the more common and primary attack surfaces that we see when it comes to just kind of cybersecurity attacks in general. So really interesting stuff here. If you have development going on in your organization, this is something that you should definitely review.
It is very interesting how this has become a primary threat vector for threat actors. And as we've talked about with things like identity and multi-factor authentication, as those get stronger and we move to things like phish resistant MFA in more places, attackers are going to look for other opportunities, areas of weakness. And it seems like they have set their targets here. This certainly feels like an area of weakness, especially how much of the software development system is dependent on these various libraries that no one really knows who's maintaining it or who's checking in code or anything else. I know there's communities around all of these, and 99.99% of people contributing to open source projects are genuinely great people who are dedicating their talents out of the goodness of their hearts. But also there is a security risk here, and it's gonna I think it's gonna get worse before it gets better. I don't think we've bottomed out yet to where we've implemented new controls and new paradigms in place to protect against this. So this is going to continue to be the weak underbelly for a little bit. And hopefully we can figure out ways to better secure these large open source projects that are broadly dependent on across the software development ecosystem. It's definitely worrisome. And I don't think anyone should sleep well at night right now, because we know there's probably more to come here. So if you have any suggestions or ideas for how to solve this, certainly make sure you're shouting from the mountaintops here, because I think everyone's kind of scratching their heads on, hey, what things can we do? What actions can we take to improve our software ecosystem?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, like, I think a lot of us in today's age are kind of under subscription fatigue and kind of charging for different things. And I would hate to say, like,
Mhm.
just charge a subscription or something like that to use the software. But that is like money motivates these people to, review the code and do the updates and put in the work, right? And so if the maintainers can make a living off of doing that, then they're probably going to put more effort into it, right? Like if they're not getting paid for it, it's like you said, they're like donating their time essentially for it. I almost think like where back in the day you would pay for a specific version, kind of like a one-time thing, right? And then like you would pay if they came out with an update. And it doesn't have to be a lot. I think back to I used this piece of software by Steve Gibson, who is one of the most renowned security researchers in the world. He is one of the hosts for Security Now, but he has is also a developer and he writes code, and he has something called SpinRite, which is a program to essentially fix your hard drives, fix errors in the hard drive. And he has a paid version for it. And I think like I don't remember exactly what the terms and conditions are, but you buy a version and you might get like all the sub versions for free. But it's not a whole lot of money. It was like 20 or $50 or something like that. And you get like, let's say 7.0, but you get all the 7.1, 7.2, 7.3 in fixes. And then he would come out with a major update like 8.0, and you'd have to purchase that particular version. So it wasn't like a subscription, but you'd
And
buy it,
usually
and
upgrade pricing
yeah,
compared to, buying new. So if you already own
correct.
7, you could upgrade to 8 at a reduced cost versus
At a
someone
reduced
coming
cost.
in brand new.
Exactly. Something like that. I really like that, and that's like kind of like an old school model of like thinking about buying, almost like boxed software. But, maybe we need to move to something like that. And basically all these companies that are using open source, software without having to pay for it, they're getting it for free, right? Like everyone's not paying for it, but this is the risk, right? So yeah, I think something does have to change, and maybe, that's something that people will start to do. But that's my idea. I think I'm not saying it's the only idea, but instead of having to pay for a subscription, you can just pay for a software version like we all used to do. Okay, so our final topic for today, I just wanted to mention because I saw this trending on Twitter/X. And because we've been talking a lot about AI and Claude, this kind of piqued my interest. So Claude, or I should say Anthropic, released on their official Twitter account that the M365 connector for Claude is now available on every Claude plan, including the free version. So what does that mean? That means that you can essentially use the M365 connector, which is published on the marketplace, and connect Claude, the application, the LLM, to your M365 data and have it reason over it. Now, it used to be gated behind a paid plan, but now they've released it um, for free on their Claude free plan. And so you do have to have a work or school account to connect it to, meaning that you probably have to be paying for like a Microsoft M365, license somewhere along that line, at least Office 365. But you can at least connect Claude for free to it. Now, when I saw this, one, I thought interesting. They're trying to kind of democratize AI and give people the ability to reason over their data for free. However, you do need a global admin to give Claude read write to everything like within Outlook, within OneDrive, within SharePoint, which is a governance decision that you have to not take lightly. It has some major security implications that any security team should be tracking closely. So if this is something that you see and you're like, oh, I'd like to play with it, make sure that you take a look at those permissions because it does give broad read permissions to your data. You can scope any OAuth application to specific users. You do not have to give it to every user. It's an enterprise app that's in Entra that you can look at who the users have access to it. You can also, after you allow, whatever rights, there's a pop-up that usually happens when you OAuth an app. There's you'll be able to see, you can hit okay, and then you can go back to the app within Entra and tailor those rights within there. Even if you've granted it rights, you can still remove, say, like read write to OneDrive and SharePoint and only give it to Outlook, or only give it to calendars and not email. And so, something that if you're looking at testing, proceed with caution and kind of talk it over and make sure that you have the right risks identified for your organization. Yeah. So that's basically my thoughts on that. Adam, I'm sure you have a few thoughts when it comes to giving this kind of permission to organizational data.
Yeah, I think you summarized it well in terms of the admin controls around this. And certainly the Microsoft guidance is you should not allow any user to make OAuth decisions on their own. It should, at a minimum, require admin approval. But this is the kind of shadow AI you can find yourself in if you're not providing access to an enterprise AI solution. And I can say certainly, look, there's been a lot of hype around this stuff. Not all of it is possible today. Some of this stuff is a little bit more boring than it is life changing. However, I can say with absolute certainty, I won't work anywhere ever again that doesn't provide me a AI productivity solution. I do use it enough daily that I would be far less productive and have far less work enjoyment if I had to do a lot of these tasks on my own. And there's plenty of people who feel that way. And so they're going to go find a solution. And if Anthropic is announcing from their X account, hey, you can sign up, use a free account, and reason over your Microsoft 365 data. And if your admin hasn't configured it in a lockdown way, you can go nuts, is very interesting and is a pretty big inflection point. Andy, when we talked in the pre-show, you were mentioning this, and I immediately said, yet. Because also famously this week, Anthropic limited access from tools like OpenClaw that use the API heavily, no longer available with a free account. Anthropic is famously capacity constrained right now. And certainly they are moving things into paid tiers as necessary to maintain their business. And especially for those who are paying for it. Anthropic, I think we're seeing this AI vibe shift right now, where all of a sudden people are realizing consumers basically don't like to pay for software. They haven't for years. That's why people like ad-supported everything on the internet. And who likes to pay for software? Who likes to pay for productivity? Enterprises do. And Anthropic beat OpenAI to this punch. They were there first. And OpenAI is going through this pivot of shutting down Sora, kind of refocusing their efforts as well on things that make money. And that's really the enterprise, because consumers, even though ChatGPT has gained this enormous mass appeal and is being used by hundreds of millions of people already, and it's the fastest growing consumer tech product in history, it doesn't make any money. I mean, let's be fair. No one in AI is making money today yet. There aren't two nickels to rub together of anyone making money. So I'm always skeptical of stuff like this, where they've opened it up to a free tier. They could just as easily pull that back too. But I think from our viewers' perspective, they maybe care less about the state of affairs from a revenue generation perspective. They care about a cybersecurity perspective. And that perspective is, it would be very reasonable for ChatGPT Enterprise to follow suit and maybe offer this connector in the free tier. It's possible. It could happen. Anthropic and OpenAI are both chasing the enterprise now. And so that's why I point out that context, is to say, this probably isn't going to happen in a vacuum. If Anthropic's doing it, OpenAI may soon follow. So you need a plan for what is our enterprise productivity AI solution strategy. And how are we going to do that? And yeah, Andy and I both work for Microsoft in the field security sales, and we do the show outside of work and self-fund the show. I'm just going to throw in the disclaimer here at the end, because we make a solution that's kind of built into the platform and comes with all the security and compliance and trust controls you'd expect. And I'm not saying you can't trust Anthropic. I'm not saying you can't trust OpenAI. But Andy, to your point, when you're opening up this API and they're starting to sip some of the data in your environment, in your Microsoft 365 environment, and offload it and take it somewhere else to reason over, even if that's temporary storage, does that create risk with your compliance requirements, with your data sovereignty requirements? Depending on your business and your industry and your geography, this is unacceptable risk to your business. You need it to stay within your existing data boundaries, within your existing compliance commitments. Microsoft can do that. And some of these other vendors, that story gets a lot more complicated when you open up this API and let Anthropic or maybe OpenAI in the future start to sip that API and start to pull data off, even if it's temporary, it could still be problematic. So, certainly, this is something our listeners need to be aware of. And I hate recommending just going and swinging the ban hammer right away. But I think instead, where you need to engage is if your company leadership is still kind of slow playing offering an enterprise grade AI productivity solution, this is maybe where we as cybersecurity professionals can say the barbarians are at the gates and we can't fend them off every more. And we're going to try to close every hole and whack every mole we can. But ultimately, you need to provide a sanctioned, trusted solution for our users, or we're going to keep having these pop up. This is only the latest example. And as I kind of laid out for you, it's very reasonable to suspect OpenAI is right behind in a similar announcement because they're both now chasing the enterprise. Because who pays for software? Who pays for productivity? The enterprise does. Consumers don't. They want ads. They want ad supported software. Now, OpenAI has dipped their toe in ad supported ChatGPT. And remember, a lot of people screamed bloody murder. Well, those people aren't giving them any money, they're costing them money. So ultimately, their opinion doesn't matter. But figuring out a monetization model for this is hard when it feels like you're putting the toothpaste back in the tube and you're trying to all of a sudden, how do you come up with a prompt that you kind of ask maybe a dental question? It goes, oh, by the way, uh, have you looked at Crest toothpaste for your kids' dental needs recently? It's going to feel really gross when they do that. So we'll see how they implement ads, but the nature of working with like a chat GPT or a Claude type experience, ads would feel really gross in there.
Mhm.
So I wish them well and hope they can figure something out. But just want to point out, like, the enterprise is where all this is at. And there is a vibe shift in AI, and everyone is turning their focus to the enterprise because that's where the money is. Just saying. So, our job as cyber defenders is be aware of that vibe shift coming and be out in front of it. And the best way to be in front of shadow IT, shadow AI, shadow anything, it's your users telling you there's a need. I have a need for this tool to do my job. And so, as opposed to being Dr. No, let's go be Dr. Yes. And let's go advocate for the solutions our users are clearly signaling they need to move forward. We're past the point of trials and POCs and kicking the tires on this stuff. It's proven that there is going to be long-term benefit to our organization. So let's build the budgets and let's support it from a cyber perspective on tooling we can support moving forward.
Yeah, it's as you were talking, I was trying to think if I were to say leave Microsoft and go to another company and they didn't have like an AI tool, like or just like say it's a newly graduate who's going to their first job, who's now probably used AI in school and used it as part of their daily, life. Um, and then they go to
Mhm.
a company and you don't have an enterprise version. I mean, they're automatically going to go to their phone and type in some sort of, whatever prompt and get it on their phone, right? Like, because everyone has phones. So unless you work in a skiff, like unless you're in the military or, in intelligence and you work in a skiff where you literally have to put your phone outside, they're going to have access to AI and they're going to put company data into
That's a really
AI.
good point.
So, I mean, like they're going to
That's
do
a
it.
really good point because with a lot of these solutions, like the consumer version of Copilot that I of course use as well because I'm a company man, it's great at take a picture of something and saying, what does this mean? Or there's even a live video option where you literally share the live video feed from your camera on your phone and you can point at stuff and ask questions about it. I literally did that this morning. I had a colleague who brought back some coffee for me from Colombia. And the entire bag is written in Spanish. And I was able to just do the live video mode and talk to the consumer copilot and say, what does this say? And of course, it blew my in-laws' mind because they have not like seen this stuff yet. But it's incredible. So it's not unreasonable to think, to your point, if I went to another employer that didn't have this, and I'm like, man, I just gotta get some help with this. I can literally take a picture with my phone or do that live video and still get help. So even if you think you've closed all the doors and closed all the loopholes, you haven't, unless to your point, you force all your employees to leave their phone at the door.
Yeah. Or you play the whack-a-mole game, right? I'm sure there's like either you're like explicitly trying to block like chatgpt.com or claude.ai or whatever or copilot or I'm sure you can use some sort of network tool or DNS tool to block that. Or maybe there's a category now and like some sort of proxy that you can just say all AI, chatbots are I'm in a category, and then you block the category, and you're offsetting that to some SaaS provider to update the categories with the different DNS. I mean, like same thing with like gambling or whatever, right? Like it's just becomes a category, and then you block it. I mean, unless you do that, which to Adam's point here, right? Like
Still
you're
doesn't
saying
stop
that
the phone thing.
it does not stop everything, and people are telling you there's a need for it, and so this genuinely does create more opportunity and speeds up productivity in general. So I know for me, whenever I'm researching a topic for anything now at work or even for the podcast, like I use AI to like help me write the notes and stuff like that. So it's kind of become ingrained into most people's daily life. If you use a computer, you search things, like it's instead of even like even now my wife, for when she like searches stuff, she doesn't even search things really in just a web browser anymore. She just goes to an AI, chat bot, whatever, and searches it that way, and it pulls from the internet and kind of aggregates the information for you. So yeah, people are going to use it. So, okay. Well, anyways, hopefully that was educational for everyone. That's our show for this week. Our contact information, along with the links to the articles that we used for the show, will be in the show notes. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future, just email us. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.